welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the seventh session of Foundations of Economic Thought Open Online course, hosted by the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets at the University of Pennsylvania. So the session will run, as always, 90 minutes, with a lecture lasting approximately 60 to 75 of them, followed by 15 to 30 minutes of live Q&A. So you're welcome to submit the questions at any time using Zoom's Q&A prompt. We are delighted today to welcome Kit Thrive, a historian of economics and senior researcher in history at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. He's the author of Construction Economic Science, The Invention of a Discipline, 1850-1950, published by Oxford University Press, which received the 2022 Best Book Award from the European Society for the History of Economic Thought. He is currently contributing to a European Research Council-funded project on the history of political economy in 18th century Sweden. In today's lecture, Kit will examine how Alfred Marshall helped transform economics from a broad public discourse into a formal academic discipline. He will focus on university reforms and Marshall's key role in establishing Cambridge undergraduate economics program, showing how economics came to be systematically taught, institutionalized, and reproduced, laying the foundations of the profession as it exists today. So please go ahead, Dr. Kit.
Thanks, Fernando. Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And what I'm going to do is, as you said, I'll start off talking a bit generally about Marshall and his context. And I'm going to talk quite a lot about what I call the modern university, because it's important to understand how economics and actually several other disciplines were created really because of the structure of the modern university. And the other thing to bear in mind is when I say modern university, what I'm thinking of is the university structure, faculty, departments, specialization, teaching, specialized teaching, which was created in the very late 19th century in the United States. So the modern university is a kind of an American invention. And as we'll see, it's an invention which is based on a productive misunderstanding of what the German university was. And related to that, I have also to clarify some international differences between universities at that time, and also why it turns out in Cambridge, why it is that, in fact, this innovation could be made. So and overall, I mean, what you should recognize from this is a kind of story about an innovation within a kind of education market, which then succeeds in a particular sort of way where it wouldn't have succeeded somewhere else. So our starting point is really the kind of what we know as the marginal revolution of the 1870s, which changed the nature of thinking about economics from one which was related to factors of production, land, labor, capital, and the revenue flows which went to them, and which had no conception of human agency in it. It simply was a mechanism, trying to figure out mechanisms for the allocation of rents, profits, and wages, into a kind of subject-oriented, consumer-oriented system in which marginal productivity, marginal changes drove the choices which economic agents made. And these economic agents were naturally real people, but actually also departments, government departments or factories or enterprises or whatever you like. So the marginal revolution is what you talk about as the 1870s. Now, there were three major names associated with this. The Englishman Jevons, the Austrian Menger, and the Frenchman Walras, and they all published important books in the early part of the 1870s, and they were all at the time professors, some kinds of professors of economics at higher education institutions. Jevons at the time in the early 1870s taught in London. Menger by 1873 was teaching in Vienna, and Walras from 1870 had a post in Lausanne in Switzerland. But the important thing about this was that although they were economists, wrote textbooks, and had, as it were, the professorial positions, none of them really had any followers or students. That they didn't. That they wrote textbooks, or they did not textbooks. They wrote books, but their actual teaching didn't lead to a cohort of students who would then go and spread the word elsewhere, go to other points, and so forth. Then they didn't have any disciples, you could say. And this is the real shift. This is why Alfred Marshall is so important. He came along. He became professor of political economy in Cambridge University in England in 1885. And by 1903, he had managed to create a 3-year specialized undergraduate degree in economics, economics and politics theoretically, but the politics was a very small part of that. And in fact, in Cambridge, politics ended up as something more to do with the history faculty than the economics faculty. But anyway, so mainly a 3-year specialized degree. Now, this was the first specialized degree, a 3-year specialized undergraduate degree in the world. And in a sense, from that point on, helped create a coherent way of training economists and then reproducing economists. And my general position is that the teaching function for economics is very important, because that's the way in which the subject itself reproduces itself. It's a process of production and reproduction. And if you don't have students, if you don't have disciples, then it will just die. And so the process has to produce, has to have students who get certified, who go away and teach other people, and generally, obviously, the way we know, they develop. So Marshall was an important economist in his own right. I mean, certainly is not simply a person famous for having founded a new course in Cambridge. And I'll talk mainly about the actual organization of the teaching and what this actually meant and why it happened in England and what became of it and so forth. And then after that, I will talk more about his major book, The Principles of Economics, which he published in 1890. That isn't, but what the thing we must always remember is that is not the textbook he used for teaching, because also important, and I'll try to bring out, is how he taught, how he had a particular conception of why it was important to teach economics in a university setting rather than actually have a public discussion of it. And he also had a particular idea of the materials which you had to use in order to teach economics, and I'll talk all about that. So that's the general idea. So I'll first of all address what I call as the modern university. And I say that really, sorry, so I'm living next to a farm track, and there's a tractor just gone by. First of all, as I said, American higher education and the American university is central to what became the sort of university structure that we know. There were obviously the older foundations in what became the United States. Harvard, Yale, Princeton were preceded independence, and they were modeled on Oxford and Cambridge. They were basically theological colleges, just like Oxford and Cambridge were until the later 19th century. The major function of Oxford and Cambridge until about the 1870s or so was to educate or to qualify clergymen and for Church of England clergymen. And in order to graduate from the University of Cambridge up to about the 1870s, you had to sign up to the 39 Articles, a kind of articles of faith of the Church of England. For Oxford, you actually had to sign up to this in order to get in. And this meant that not only were Oxford and Cambridge automatically restricted to males, they excluded Catholics, dissenters, Jews, anybody else. It was basic, they were Church of England foundations. And so that gives you a sense of the limited, the kind of nature of Oxford and Cambridge. This wasn't the other thing which I should say is that London University, which started off in the 1820s, by the 1850s was forming into a general examining body, which then underwrote the foundation of other universities in Britain, or university colleges in Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Bristol, in these major centres. And so London University was important. And I'll come on to that later, because basically what we now know as the London School of Economics, which was founded in 1895, was part and a very important part of London University. So the basic issue there then is that why is it that Marshall was able to innovate in Cambridge, and he wouldn't have been able to do the same sort of thing, create a 3-year degree at the time in either Oxford or in Cambridge. So basically, coming back to American higher education, there were the older colleges, and then through the 19th century, there were many private and state initiatives, land grant colleges with respect to the states, and of course, lots, especially in postbellum America, a lot of private foundations and funding, enormous amounts of money going into education compared with Britain, certainly. So there is this great boom in general education, higher education. But in the 1870s, 1880s, there was virtually no graduate level education. There was no way of moving on from an undergraduate degree. And those people who were actually particularly interested in some kind of university career, obviously were interested in getting some kind of further education. And this led to a great wave of emigration of American students to Europe, and they went to Germany. And the reason they went to Germany was there was no point going to England, because there was no higher education of this kind, no more advanced education in England. In France, the French system was actually closed to anybody who hadn't been at a French school. And the German system was not only actually the most sort of famous system in the world. I mean, it was thought to be the center of the university, world university culture. But it was basically state run and open. So all universities in Germany were run as education institutions by the local states. By states, I mean Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, Prussia, the basic constituent states of the new German Empire. So they were public institutions, and professors were simply civil servants, actually, and they still are, still classified as civil servants. So these students went to in the 1880s, 1870s a bit, mainly the 1880s and some the 1890s, went across all subjects, went to Germany, audited lectures, because simply anyone could sign up for lectures, sign on for lectures, and go and attend lectures. And several of them actually took PhDs. They basically took advanced degrees. And this was certainly true of economists. And they came back, and then they, as it were, entered the American system and helped change the American system into the sort of system we know now. Now, basically, the system they found, the German university system, was based on 4 faculties. The theology faculty was at the top of it originally. Then there was medicine, law, and philosophy. And by naming the first 3, we can see the theology faculty obviously trained clergy, the medical faculties trained physicians, the law faculties trained lawyers, and philosophy faculty trained teachers, effectively. That was what it was for. Although the international reputation of German science was rooted very much in the university, the German universities were essentially vocational institutions. Most of the students who went there in order to as a pathway into their job, and that was straightforward. The place where you could innovate was the teaching faculty, the most junior faculty. It was like a general studies faculty. And here you had professors, you did actually have economists who were individual economists who worked in these places, and they gave lectures. But there were no courses. The only formal qualification in economics in Germany actually until 1923 was a doctorate. There was no undergraduate degree. So basically, that's why so many American students ended up doing doctorates. But the basic issue was that the German professor was a kind of the central node of knowledge for the subject. That they were king of their subject, and then this king had all these little helpers and organized everything. So the departments didn't exist. What the American students did, because they only saw the graduate side of German universities, they tended to think this is what they were about, and they went back and replicated parts of this. And importantly, what they did was they changed this professorial figure who was a center of teaching and who basically conveyed everything to students in lectures, into departments which were based on a specialized division of knowledge. So basically, departments developed in the United States for the first time in universities, because also the change to an elective system from the point of view of students, that basically departments had to cover a large number of topics, and individuals became specialists in these topics. And so a department in an American university became based on the division of labor, basically a number of specialists working together covering a particular subject. And so that's really where the original department comes from, and that's really very much to do with the nature of the, say, modern universities. But there's a but here. So basically, if this is true, that all these American economists are coming back and forming departments, and very many notable economists working in America by the 1890s, American Economic Association exists, and there's all the major journals, the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the Journal of Political Economy exist by the early 1890s. So there's a lot of recognizable activity related to what we'd regard as an economics discipline. But they all taught on a non-specialized undergraduate degree. So basically, the kind of undergraduate degree course you had in the United States was very much sort of the same as you have now. It was essentially unspecialized. And so although you could have individual economists, students who were interested in the subject, these specialized teachers in departments couldn't actually train economists systematically unless they became graduates, and there were just not enough graduates. So there was the one thing I should say, there's work I've been doing more recently on mainly English economic history and partly French economic history, is what is very striking is that there are a very large number of American graduate students who have basically created the framework for European economic history. And so, just to take one example, the English corn laws, which are to do with the regulation of the grain trade and prices and whatever, and which, when they were abolished in 1845, heralded a period of free trade and very symbolic. The standard book on this was published in 1930, written by an American student who had spent about 2 years working in the archives in London, and there still is no better book. The main book on the French 17th century grain trade is by another American student. There's just, it's quite remarkable the number of specialized works, especially in Britain, which were created by graduate students, which are still recognizably of extreme value. But this was all fairly dispersed. In chronological terms, it wasn't until the 1930s that there were enough graduates in order to sort of build programs. And so by the mid-1930s in Chicago, for example, there were graduate courses and structured courses with about 30 students. And we know that from the work Roger Backhouse has done on Paul Samuelson, who unofficially attended graduate courses in Chicago while he was an undergraduate, and then he went to Harvard. So 1930s is this turning point. So the important point, just to get the difference here, what happens then and why the Americans became so dominant for the rest of the century, was that the English, who had invented a specialized program of teaching of economics, remained with an undergraduate program. So basically, there were hardly any graduate, well, there were no graduate courses. I think the first proper, there were individual graduates who had supervisors and who did work and whatever, but that wasn't a career path. Basically, most English economists who you might have heard about or through into the late 20th century didn't have any postgraduate qualifications at all. They just took in a job and there were no, so not only did they not have any postgraduate qualification, they'd had no systematic training. That has obviously now changed, but this is quite late. I mean, it happens from the 1970s onwards. So what we have in Britain is this perseverance with a 3-year specialized undergraduate degree, for which there is actually very little demand from employers anyway. So this is very limited. In the United States, this is quite different. You have, when you do start graduate training, there seems to be a very large demand for qualified graduates for teaching, for business and government, and so this possibility creates a virtuous circle which expands teaching. Basically, that's a very crude outline of what the difference is. Why something can be invented in one place, but the conditions which make it possible to invent it become eventually the conditions which mean that it can't actually become bigger and more significant. So specialization is important in that. England basically is stuck with 3-year degrees, specialized degrees. This is still the case, and my own personal opinion is this has always been a major handicap. The American system, and especially the American liberal arts colleges, are admirable institutions which are far more appropriate for the kind of age that of the students they have, and that the specialized 3-year undergraduate degree as the major form in which students learn is a problem, and so that's where we are now. But basically, because this existed, because of this this concentration on a 3-year degree, it meant that there was a possibility of making innovation in Cambridge in this case. So now to turn to Cambridge, a few more clarifications. Cambridge University as an institution is a sort of federal body. It's basically a holding company which runs exams and runs teaching programs. but students live and are associated with colleges, but which are not linked directly to the teaching program. And so actually, to the best of my knowledge, there was no Department of Economics in Cambridge as a building, and people actually had offices until the 1960s. That actually everyone was dispersed around colleges. The colleges are autonomous bodies. So it's the university which is the teaching and examining institution, which is actually different to Oxford, and this is the reason why Cambridge was in Oxford. The colleges basically ran the teaching, so it was much more difficult to innovate on a university-wide basis in Oxford. So in Cambridge, the main degree which people took in the mid 19th century was mathematics. In Oxford, it was classics. So basically, the sort of high level degree which you did in Cambridge was mathematics, what they called tripos. All 3-year degrees are called triposes. That's still the name for them. Basically, the idea is that originally, when these were oral exams, students were examined by sitting on a 3-legged stool, and so that's why they call it a tripos, as the story goes. So basically, the main honours degree was a mathematics degree, and this was a written degree. And for various reasons, it was actually mostly pretty obsolete mathematics. It was Newtonian, mainly geometric-based mathematics. But that didn't matter. It didn't matter that actually what students were taught was, by continental European standards, actually rather backward. Because it created a teaching program which became highly competitive. Now, the colleges didn't actually have specialist teachers in mathematics. Although mathematics was the main thing, the colleges didn't actually recruit or make a very much of getting skilled teachers in mathematics. Instead, private tutors set up and recruited students to train them, those students who wanted to become or wanted to be highly ranked, because this was a ranked part. You passed out on a ranked order. When they wanted a high rank, they would pay a private tutor to train them in classes to run through all the techniques and problems which they could expect to find in the exam. And the exam was basically a test of how quickly you could spot what technique you required in order to solve this problem. That was basically what the maths structure was. Now, these private tutors were called coaches because they were by analogy with the coach which came from Cambridge, the horse stagecoach. The tutors drove their teams. They basically saw this. So basically, the tutors competed among themselves for good students, and so the whole atmosphere was highly competitive. And linked to this, also ironic, I mean, just as an aside, linked to this was the actual fact that the maths exam took up to about 2 weeks of almost continual examination. It was a severe test of intellectual stamina, and in order to survive this, you also needed physical stamina. So walking and rowing became a major activity, and this is how the idea of a sports coach bled over from this original idea of a coach for things. So these were coaches. So basically, a lot of pressure. So this is all very competitive, drilling in problem solving, and Marshall entered this program in the early 1860s, and he graduated in 1865, ranked second. And you can get some idea of the kind of competitor, or how good he would have been, because the person who beat him won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1904. So there was a big shift in the later part of the century in Cambridge towards the natural sciences and physics, and the mathematics degree changed and became much more modern. But still, it was this kind of ranked system and very competitive. So the reason why I've talked about the mathematics, the structure of the mathematics degree, is because this kind of way of thinking about training students in techniques which can have applications, or also the ability to determine what is the right technique you require for this particular problem and how to resolve it, is something which he took over into his economics teaching. But as I'll come on to in a bit, he was not a technical teacher in the normal course of events. He would use geometry in his teaching, but the great marker of Marshall was the fact that he was very, very interested in all kinds of empirical applied information and so on. And so he was a voracious collector of information on the economies. In 1875, he visited the United States and made a tour of factories and made detailed notes about all of this. He was just really interested in the actual nuts and bolts of how the economy worked. So 1865, he graduates, he goes away a bit, but basically then in the late 1860s, he becomes a tutor in the college. He's in St. John's College, Cambridge. He becomes a tutor for a new, what we'd regard as roughly a social sciences tripos. It was the moral sciences tripos. This had started in 1860. Basically, the maths tripos still existed and still was central, but there was a lot of criticism that this was that there should be some sort of diversification. And one result of this was the creation, roughly from 1860, of this new moral sciences tripos, which combined what we would see as social sciences, moral and political philosophy, what we would see as today philosophy, mental philosophy, logic, and also political economy. So there's four main subjects, and political economy is taught as part of this tripos. And this is where Marshall first starts teaching political economy within this framework. He also, in the early 1870s, contributes to the teaching of women students. And so what started happening in the 1870s was that some of the fellows or lecturers and professors got together privately and trained and taught women students privately, and ran them through the exams. They got the exam papers, brought them to a special exam room. The women sat the exams, they marked them, and so they got graded. And this was the beginning of women's education in Cambridge. And Marshall not only had a part in that, he actually married one of his students in the 1870s. But since he actually married her, he at that time in the later 1870s, he couldn't actually remain a fellow of his college, because if he was a fellow, he had to be single. And so he went off to Bristol to become principal of what was the new university in Bristol, or University College in Bristol, and so then to Oxford, and then only in 1885 he came back to teach in Cambridge. Now, political economy was taught in the 1860s when Marshall was a student and when he was a tutor. But there was a professor of political economy, had been from the 1817, sort of doing a few courses. No, actually, a lot of professors didn't actually teach in the early part of the century. But in the person who, well, the teaching on political economy in Cambridge by the professor of political economy was to ordinary students, to past degree students, not within the moral sciences tripos. So Henry Fawcett, who was actually the professor from the early 1860s until he died in 1884, he never taught on the moral sciences tripos. So he didn't teach in a specialized degree, tripos, honors degree. When in 1885, Marshall came back to Cambridge and he was appointed the new professor of political economy. It's interesting that he did immediately did several things. First of all, he pulled the teaching of political economy into this moral sciences tripos, the formal subject of teaching. Another thing was, which is very unusual, in the university's internal reporter, I mean, the printed medium of communication within the university, he advertised to students to come and talk to him any time, particularly like run office hours, which was extremely unusual at that time for fellows. And he also began to agitate to expand the teaching of economics. And part of this was based on the problem that the moral sciences tripos, I've talked about how the maths tripos was organized, which is analytical, very competitive, incredibly intense. The moral sciences tripos basically involved reading a few books. That was what basically involved. It didn't involve this kind of analytical training, the pressure involved in all of that. And in part, that was what he was chafed against, that he wanted to both expand the teaching of political economy and also make it much more analytical. So what we can say is that I say that he had a particular idea about what he would do with economics. I can quote that, I think, from the so I'll just read a passage out from the outline. He gave in February 1885, a couple of months after he started, he gave his inaugural lecture. And he made this very famous sort of ending to it, what it has become very famous, and talked about what economics was for. And he said, think of the force that university men might bring to bear by their personal influence. If great numbers of them had learnt to think clearly and had studied the subject matter of the age in which they live, they might then take a wise and active part in relieving misery without making pauperism, in helping people to educate themselves and rise to a higher level, to become not only more efficient producers, but also wiser consumers, with greater knowledge of all that is beautiful and more care for it. And so then he goes on, it will be my most cherished ambition, my highest endeavor, to do what my poor ability and my limited strength I may to raise the number of those whom Cambridge, the great mother of strong men, sends out into the world with cool heads but warm hearts, willing to give some at least of their best powers to grappling with the social suffering around them, resolved not to rest content till they have done what in them lies to discover how far it is possible to open up to all the material means of a refined and noble life. And so it's basically a very sort of almost sort of religious drive for seeing of training men, because this is the way the university works, training men in these analytical techniques, which are going to basically in universities, in business, in government, are going to aid the betterment of welfare of all. So that's his basic idea. And the other point is, how did he go about this? Now, I mentioned earlier on that he didn't use the principles of economics are published in 1890 as a textbook. But what we do know, we do have a set of his lecture notes from the early 1890s, which actually indicate that he had a very sort of, what would you say, almost a ramshackle way of teaching. He would come in and he would start talking about something that would be in the paper and then go on to analyze it. So he would use geometric techniques on blackboards and stuff in the lecture room, but he would not pre-prepare a kind of very formal presentation. He would tend to just talk about something that was happening and analyze that. Similarly, we also know from his teaching of Maynard Keynes that Maynard Keynes actually graduated in mathematics in 1905, and he wanted to go into the civil service, for which he had to know some political economy. And Marshall was a friend, well, a neighbor effectively of the Keynes family. The Maynard Keynes' father, Neville Keynes, was a teacher on the moral sciences tripos initially, and then for years and years a senior administrator, or the senior administrator of the University of Cambridge. So Maynard Keynes, in the latter part of 1905, took classes, as it were, individual classes with Marshall, and he left behind. And in the Keynes papers, there are a number of the papers he wrote and a record of what he was taught. And interestingly, for example, the longest essay that he wrote was on national railway systems. I mean, so what was noticeable is that before when Keynes was on his own, he read a lot of theoretical works. When Marshall taught him using very practical materials about real structures of the economy and so forth. So that's roughly, I mean, I can talk more about that if you want, about his teaching style and how that worked. Now, just move on to roughly what sort of economics he left behind him, or what he did with economics. Marshall was born in 1842 and died in 1924, so in his early 80s. The Principles of Economics was published in 1890 when he was nearly 50, whereas Jevons' Theory of Political Economy had been published when Jevons was in his 30s. And actually, there was only 7 years difference, age difference. Jevons was only 7 years older than Marshall. But Marshall published way later than Jevons published his major book on political economy. Now, what's important here is that really Marshall worked very slowly and methodically. The Principles, when it first came out in 1890, was volume 1. It wasn't explained what the rest was going to be, and there never was a volume 2. And sometimes assumed that volume 2 was meant to be some more applied aspect of the subject. In fact, what later he wrote in 1910 on the 6th edition, because he kept on revising and rewriting the Principles through to 1920. What he had in mind was actually a more German multi-volume work, which included material on government activities, social policy, economic policy, currency, banking, and all the rest of it. So this was meant to be a much bigger work, and the Principles was only the first of these books. Also, another point that must be emphasized, although Marshall did actually invent most of the sort of geometrical kind of the graphic analysis that became very popular in the mid 20th century for teaching economics. In his Principles, this was all in footnotes. There are only about 7 or 8, I think it is, graphs in Principles. There's a mathematical appendix, but the text itself is all pure narrative. The footnotes is the all. So the argument is carried forward purely as a narrative, not as a thing. So it's not actually a textbook. And we know from his teaching that he didn't use the Principles as his own textbook. So that's something we need to bear in mind. But it is true to say that his the book Principles of Economics, did provide the kind of conceptual foundation for what became known as microeconomics, which excluded what then became in the 1940s macroeconomics. The maths was in the footnotes, in the appendix, and the graphs were in the footnotes. And in fact, a more modern-looking book, actually. I can show you if anyone's interested. I've got one behind me. Is a book 1908 by Wicksteed, who was then used later on by British economists to rewrite Marshall's work. And also, there's a nice little book by one of Marshall's students called Cunningham, which is purely exposition of the geometry which Marshall used. So what we must bear in mind with his Principles is its German roots, that it was this compendium which existed, and he says that the first volume avoids currency and markets, industry and employment. Then, after the First World War, he did publish 2 more books. He published Industry and Trade in 1919 and Money, Credit and Commerce in 1923. This is the material that was intended to be part of his Principles of Economics as conceived and written in the 1880s. But of course, the material, if you look at Industry and Trade, they're very interesting books, very dense and interesting books. But if you look at these books, the material they draw on is from the 1870s and 1880s. So publishing this in 1919 and 1923 means that it looks like economic history, that it's kind of doesn't relate to the modern world. And so that's in a sense, and this is also important. So he worked slowly and methodically, and ultimately he never really wrote the book he intended to write, had intended in the 1880s to write. He never got it, pulled it all together. And in fact, his major legacy, obviously the book became a major seller. In fact, in my book, I've got a Constructive Economic Science. I have the sales figures for it, which show that it was sold very strongly in the United States as well. But the legacy really that he has is more like the people who he taught. So first of all, he taught Maynard Keynes his economics in the first instance. Maynard Keynes went off to the India office and taught himself enough about Indian currency to make that the first book which he wrote. Then he went back to Cambridge and became a lecturer on money up until the First World War, when he went to the Treasury, then resigned from the Treasury, resigned from Cambridge. And during the 1920s, Keynes basically wrote journalism. He was editor of the Economic Journal, the academic journal. What we can see in Keynes in this period, in the kind of writing he was involved in the 1920s, is this linkage of analytical acumen with a very solid grasp of economic affairs and reality. Similarly, the successor to Marshall in 1908, Marshall retired in 1908, and he was succeeded by Arthur Pigou, who was at that time was only 30, and who was a brilliant expositor of the Marshallian kind of approach. He in the by about 1904, 1905, he had invented what became kind of like the modern economic paper, a short problem, graphic exposition, and so the kind of thing you would see in the 1950s and 1960s as a standard paper, and it's short. Whereas if you look at virtually any economic journal, American or British, before in the period up to the 1920s, that you get all kinds of rambling papers. Francis Edgeworth, who was definitely a very analytical Anglo-Irish economist, actually wrote very, very long articles, 3-part articles. And so so Pigou actually invented the short form, one problem, resolve the problem kind of paper for publishing. And he also had very great interest in economic welfare. But the problem with Pigou was that he in a sense was broken by the First World War. He was a Quaker and therefore a conscientious objector, and so basically he stayed in Cambridge and taught. But during the long vacations, a lot of vacations in Cambridge, because the term is only 8 weeks, during the vacations he would go and drive ambulances in Italy and in Belgium. So there's a record of him being already in Christmas vacation 1914. He was driving an ambulance in Flanders. So, and he saw a lot of things, and in some sense that sort of broke him in a way. After the war, he was never quite the same. And Pigou then, he lived till 1959, but he just wrote. Pigou just had no impact upon the teaching in Cambridge after that time. That whereas Marshall had been so keen on reorganizing teaching and in Cambridge, Pigou showed very little engagement with that at all, and basically just wrote a number of very, very important works, very interesting works, which then became more and more misunderstood. So he's sort of going through a sort of revival now. But basically, he was one of the major legacies from Marshall. So to finish up, what I'd say is that Marshall creates this new specialized course of economics. For reasons which I don't think I can really go into at the moment, is that then the London School of Economics takes over as the leading British centre in the 1930s, with a completely different approach, with basically with very little interest in real world affairs, and a didactic geometry-led mode of exposing to undergraduates the subject. This is Robbins from 1930. And so the Marshallian breadth and idea of combining, of having techniques which you apply to different problems, and you need to know the problems in order to apply the problems properly, this disappeared from teaching in Britain. Pigou was similar with this analytical and empirical cast, but after the war, he mainly just wrote books, and also he couldn't supervise students because professors weren't allowed to supervise students in the new regime in the 1920s. So he couldn't. All he could do was to give lectures, and the lectures he gave, interestingly, were mostly elementary lectures. He didn't, as it were, give the most advanced lectures in the course. He gave the most elementary lectures in the course. Keynes, as we know, Maynard Keynes, is always associated with Cambridge, but in fact he was not employed by the University of Cambridge after 1920. He was a King's College Fellow. He had his own sources of finance. He wrote for the Times for money. He wrote economic journalism was a very big thing. So he really developed a lot of the ideas that Marshall had started off with, but then ended up in a completely different place. And another thing that's important in the American context, thinking of Keynes, is because one of the problems about the reputation of Maynard Keynes is that his reception in different countries was different. So in Britain, what happened was that the major impact of Maynard Keynes post 1936 in his general theory was in economic administration, because the war came and he went back into the Treasury, and economists went to work in the various parts of the government and created, among other things, national income accounting. The 1941 English budget was the first one, which was based on national income accounting entities. In America, on the other hand, the reception of Keynes was almost entirely theoretical, university-based, and this helps explain why macroeconomics, as we came to know it in the 1940s, became an American thing. And so one of the things that is important here is to look back at the early years of Keynes and to look at the kinds of things he was interested in, the kinds of activities he was involved in, the kinds of way he thought. And really, ultimately, he had the same kind of basic idea as Marshall, that you had to have tools to analyze conditions, and you needed to train students in ways to do that. So I'll end there, and if there are any questions, I can try and respond to them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kitt. We have a couple of questions already. The first one is very broad. It says, how conscious was Alfred Marshall of the long-term institutional impact of creating a specialized undergraduate curriculum for economics? Did he view this primarily as a pedagogical reform, or was he intentionally shaping a new professional identity?
It's a good question. I think, the major thing was the pedagogical thing. Something I haven't mentioned was that that Marshall was instrumental in 1890, same year as his book came out, in creating the British Economic Association, which is the corollary to the American Economic Association, except the British Economic Association was a vehicle for publishing this new journal, the Economic Journal. And this is, again, a very Marshallian kind of conception, an economic journal which was basically not rooted in any institution. So Journal of Political Economy is Chicago, Quarterly Journal of Economics is Harvard. The Economic Journal was related to the British Economic Association, which in the early 1900s was renamed the Royal Economic Society. And so this was a kind of non-partisan journal which enabled where there wasn't a kind of a party line approach or possibly developed. So that was one of his forms of vision. So basically, that's not pedagogical, but actually that's a way of thinking forward for how the subject might develop. I'm not sure. It's a good. I hadn't really thought about the long-term thinking of the pedagogy. I think there's a lot of documentation around the early 1900s where he's arguing for the kind of structure and the kind of nature of each economic teaching there should be. But this doesn't take the form of thinking forward. And actually, one thing that occurs to me, occurring at roughly the same time as this, a bit after this, is that just as an analogy of what happens in institutions like this, the Harvard Business School was created, I think, around about 1905, 1906. I can't remember exactly now, with a 2-year course. And for years, everyone left after 1 year because no one could think what would come in the second course. So they launched this institution, which obviously became world famous, and they didn't actually arrive at a 2-year structured course until the 1920s, and especially their case study method then that helped with that. And I think that that in a sense, if we refer that back to Marshall, you say, well, someone in his position arguing for the development of a particular body of teaching, he would be so concerned with the actual nuts and bolts of what should be taught, what you can do. And there's a general framework, which I've outlined, but which is just sort of projected into a future. And the other thing I could say is actually what happened in Britain was not that you eventually had a number of economics departments developing different universities. Actually, you had faculties of commerce developing. And in fact, the way that the economics was taught in Britain outside Oxford and Cambridge was as parts of commerce degrees mainly. The London School of Economics was a vocational commercial college when it was created in 1895. And so economics was a part of this other thing. So the way that actually, even when he was dying in 1924, he had been well aware of this, the sort of landscape which he was familiar with, his students went off not to become in Liverpool and Manchester, for example, not to become professors of economics. They went to become professors of commerce with much more practical and broad-based things. And so that would mitigate his forward thinking in economics. That was the way things developed.
A related question to that is, you mentioned a lot of practical aspects of the teaching of economics, but did these people read Adam Smith and David Ricardo in their undergraduate economics curriculum, or they did not deal with that?
Well, Ricardo is overrated insofar as Marshall had a he tended to keep on talking about Ricardo, or he would say how much he thought of Ricardo, but there's no evidence of it in his actual writing or thinking. He tended that one of the curious things about Marshall was that he was a very practical person and knew a lot of stuff. But if he was pushed for an example, he would tend to make things up. So that the best example of this is the so-called Giffen good, inferior good, whatever, named for Robert Giffen, who was a chief statistician of the Board of Trade in the government, and he actually denied there was such a thing as this kind of good. But basically, so we can't really take seriously what Marshall says about Cornell and Ricardo. Smith, the reputation of Adam Smith in the 19th century was mainly in terms of ideas, the ideas of free trade and so forth, were mainly to do with ideas of economic liberty, not to do with the nuts and bolts of international trade. Marshall did write, he's got the large unpublished manuscript on international trade from the 1870s, which is, so he's all into the technicalities of trade debate, disputes and so forth. But this doesn't take the form of developing on work of Smith. It is a paradox that actually, because I've done a bibliography of Adam Smith, is that in the later 19th century, in Britain, virtually every year or every other year, there was a new edition of Wealth of Nations. But there's no evidence in any of the literature you read that anyone particularly read this with any interest. The only people, Smith only became a subject for scholars after the Germans created the so-called Adam Smith problem, and it's only in the 1890s that actually Smith scholarships in the way we know it today started. So there's no, this is really the marginal revolution, the 1870s, was really a fresh start. You didn't need what's the point of talking about Ricardo and Smith effectively once you're working in the way that Jevons and Marshall and Edgeworth worked in the later 19th century.
A third related question is Oxford's famous program of philosophy, politics, and economics was later created in the 1920s. Was this created as a response to the Cambridge economics curriculum, or is it not related at all?
Not really. It's 1920. It starts. It's a bit murky exactly how this happens. Now, the important point is that the economics, it's PPE with E as the last, because the economists weren't interested in this at all, really. They played no part in it. It was driven along mainly by the philosophers. And I think it was a way to create a modern subject. So it's a bit murky because it comes at the end of the First World War, when there aren't many students and it's not clear what's going on. But the other problem is that the professor of political economy at that time was Francis Edgeworth, appointed in 1891. He wasn't interested in teaching at all. So there was no drive from him to push that in. There was a certificate in economics in the 1905, 1906, and there was some basic teaching. But most of the people who taught economics or economic related subjects in Oxford in the early 1920s were historians. And it's to do with actually there weren't. So for example, just skipping ahead, so Lionel Robbins, who became professor of political economy at LSE from 1930 to the 1960s. He had two spells in Oxford in the 1920s, but he went to New College. All the teaching of political economy, economics in Oxford at that time was done in colleges, unlike in Cambridge. And so he was a college lecturer there. And that college lecturer means basically just supervising students, tutoring students in the Oxford context. And PPE, and also my PPE is like my sort of bugbear as well, because it represents, you know, the kind of the worst evolution of the teaching of economics, because although in fact you can specialize more in economics now, what in Britain we find is that large numbers of people in politics and media and government and whatever actually are Oxford graduates. I mean, David Cameron was one. Johnson was a classics graduate from Oxford, but everyone seems to have a PPE. I think Rachel Reeves, the current chancellor, has one as well. They all went to Oxford and did a PPE, and so it means they've done very little economics, and that's all they've done, because basically in Britain still the idea of doing, well, the rule of thumb is that if you do an MA or master's in economics, you are looking for some kind of job in finance, maybe in business. If you do a PhD, that's the only destination is an academic destination. There's no interest anywhere else for that sort of thing. And so an undergraduate degree, as I started out from in Britain, is still very much thought to be, you know, a big thing. Whereas in the United States, in my understanding, an undergraduate degree is for a talented person simply the starting point, you know. So the PPE was, but also, I mean, paradoxically, in Oxford, it did actually have important teachers like James Mead, for example, in the 1930s. And also the other thing that's important, sorry, this is another thing thinking about Oxford and Cambridge, another peculiar characteristic here is that in Oxford, for some reason, they were much more open to emigres from continental Europe in the 1930s. In fact, there were hardly any in the 1930s in Cambridge. Cambridge is much more self-enclosed, whereas Morgenstern goes to goes to Oxford, and there's a whole series of Central European and Northern European emigres who end up in Oxford between the 1930s and the 1940s, which is just not the case in Cambridge. And of course, what they bring with them is a much greater mathematical ability than their opposite numbers in Britain had at the time. So it's just a thought about Oxford.
So changing subjects a little bit, Mar Rubio asks, you have mentioned Marshall's wife in passing, but if I am not mistaken, the first version of the principles was signed as Marshall and Marshall, the second being his wife, and later was removed from the authorship in subsequent editions. Can you tell us more about that? Because related also to, well, yeah.
Right. So this is Alfred and Mary Paley Marshall, Economics Industry. It's a book for teaching, which is where he came together with her, which was first published in 1879. So this is the book he produced with her. And this was used for adult education and was really sold very well, very popular. But it is a very curious book when you read it. One of the things, the major feature of curiosity about it is when it's expounding elements of economic theory, it expounds it in such a way that you really have to understand what it means in order to understand the way it's being described. Now, Marshall was very much a sort of a misogynist, a very peculiar mixture of a person. And he tended to blame, he later life, he blamed Mary Marshall for the weak bits of this book. I think that's mistaken. I think it's the problems in it are to do with him, with his early ideas, because he never seemed to really, he was very slow to develop his ideas, but he didn't, as it were, acknowledge that in the slowness to develop his ideas, he left a lot of ideas behind. And so this is some of the ideas he left behind. And when he looked back at it 10, 12 years later, he didn't like what he saw. But then, say, well, I got two books out. That's the Economics Industry. He then tried, when his principles came out in 1890, he tried to suppress any more copies of this, and then he published this thing, which is also called Economics of Industry, it's called Elements of the Economics of Industry, 1892, and this is a short version of the 1890 principles by him. So it's a completely different book from that, but roughly the same title. And part of the reasons why he would choose exactly the same title for the two works is unclear. But my own view is that, I mean, he was a curious character in a lot of ways with things. But my own view is that why he wanted, he would have said, or people would assume, that it's because his joint authorship with his wife that he wanted this suppressed. I think it's because the parts that he felt embarrassed about were his own work rather than that of Mary Marshall, as for what it's worth. But no one's ever gone through it to look at it. I mean, I have written about this in some detail, but it is an interesting book to read through because you start wondering about how the way the exposition works, and it is very, very curiously exposed for the kind of book, for the kind of readership. It's written for adult education, so adults who are some way away from having had their formal education, and for that purpose, the so-called university extension texts.
Okay. Yeah. So related also to the reception of Marshall's work, you previously talked a little bit about American and German university systems. Do you know if Marshall influenced those in some way or not?
Influenced America or?
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, well, the German, his book was translated into German in the 1904, 5. But I mean, what I would say about German is a curious feature. I mean, because I'm a sort of specialist on Max Weber as well, and I've recently published, or was just about now published, an essay on his teaching in the 1890s. Weber was a teacher of political economy in the 1890s, and his lectures are still lecture notes and students' lecture notes are now printed in the collected works. There are about 5 volumes or so. And what's interesting about German economics and German science, I think, in the 1890s, was that they really paid little attention to what was going on elsewhere. So, in social science terms, people always used to go on about Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and so the question would arise is, what about, not about Marx and Weber, but what about Weber and Durkheim? And there's no evidence in anything I've ever read of Weber that he actually knew Durkheim existed, his contemporary in France, who in Bordeaux was a professor of political economy. So my impression of what's going on in the German university system is it's very in the 1890s and early 1900s was it's increasingly more closed in on itself and isn't looking elsewhere. So one of the things that is typical of actually all international journals of this time, the new journals, the JPE and QJE and the EJ and whatever, is that at the end of each edition, they would have a survey of what's been published in international journals. And so you could have a conspectus, what's in the Dutch journals, what's in the French journals, what's in the American, and all this stuff in the EJ say. And this is common to the American journals and to the French and the English, but not the Germans. The Germans don't do this kind of survey of forms. There are only individuals who are specialists in all of this. So in America, on the other hand, his work does sell very well. And years and years ago, I did a lot of work on the trust question in the 1890s and the early 1900s. And what I noticed in the American journals was the degree to which they relied as the kind of bedrock analysis on Marshall. This only lasted up until about 1910s or so. But there was a period in the 1890s and early 1900s when, for American economists as well, Marshall was the key person. But of course, their system was so large that they had all sorts of other people who would become important. But I say that in my book, I mean, I can't pull it out now, but what's striking is the sales figures which are available for Principles of Economics separate out American editions, and it sold consistently through to the 1930s in the United States as well as in Britain and Europe.
Thank you. Now a question by Argeno Prat, which I will paraphrase a little bit. It's kind of a methodological question on basically how important is or how relevant is for historians of economic thought to also think in terms of history of the evolution of economics as an academic discipline, not just in terms of ideas, but in terms of the field itself.
As an academic discipline? So I think that, so my book, Constructing Economic Science, is really about that. It's a discipline, so it has a lot about French, German, and British institutions and what they taught and how they taught. So full of all that kinds of things. And so and there is an increasing interest now in how you get standardization happening. That basically one of the paradoxes. I mean, so as looking at the British university landscape, a paradox which you could say is that although after the Second World War there were about 8 or 9 new universities, the new universities were founded. They're all meant to have different teaching plans. They were meant to innovate in teaching. By 2000, they were all the same. So basically, there's some kind of way in which, and it's to do with regulation and all sorts of things, student expectation. But what's interesting is that the way in which teaching was delivered, and what the innovative ideas about teaching, which places like Sussex or Kiel, or York or Lancaster or where else, Kent, had, Essex, where I went, Essex, very innovative, and that's all gone. And so what that shows is this some kind of peculiar way in which there's a kind of movement towards the mean somehow going on. And I think the same sort of thing happens within university teaching. Obviously, textbooks are extraordinarily important, because as teaching has become more more large scale with modules and so forth, the textbooks become very much more important. In the mid 1950s, nobody taught with textbooks in the LSE. Basically, that the students were assigned journal papers and whatever as their basic materials. Now there's a textbook for every course, and so this is actually creates a great impetus for standardizing what is taught and how it's taught. So in a sense that, and I think that's a problem. I mean, it runs against the sort of thing, the way in which teach. But again, the other thing I could say is that, Marshall's ideal, or his aim for what became economics as it in the 20th century, what he aspired to, just required too much work. It was, in a sense, that this exactly the same thing happened to commerce in Britain. Commerce teaching had all sorts of stuff on banking and practical aspects of shipping and whatever, languages, whatever, and this became all too complicated to hold together. And in some respects, one of the features of the way that economics has become more technical is at some level it's become simpler. That is, it's kind of more, it's easier to kind of everything converge and to kind of discriminate between things, and to know what a mainstream is. There is no mainstream in the United States. I mean, that's what the research graduate school, I mean, that one of the conclusions of the Teagle report, I think it is, saying that actually everyone talks about the core, but they have different ideas of what the core is. But all the same, I mean, there is this kind of centripetal force, kind of, which, rather than actually things falling apart or diversifying, which we would see as a good thing for competition, but competition actually creates similarity. Everything begins to look the same. It's a kind of hoteling, shopping mall effect, really, that everything ends up looking the same, effectively. And that's what happens to university education of economics, I think.
Thank you. So one final question. What bibliography can you recommend for a biographical approach to Alfred Marshall?
What
bibliography, a book, an article about
right. Well, I'd say I think actually, I mean, there is a big biography by Peter Groenewegen. It's Dutch, originally a Dutch person, but it's very big. It's about 400 pages. But I can't remember. But I could check. But the you've got the American Dictionary of National Biography. We've got the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and in that you would find that's a really useful source for usually well-written and informative accounts of individual persons, and with evaluations of their work. And in a sense, I always used to refer my students. There are a few which aren't so good, but I used to refer my students to the Oxford Dictionary and National Biography as a good starting point, because you got immediately a sense of the person and their career and what they did. And that's I think, I can't remember offhand who wrote the Marshall entry. But that, again, I mean, if that person was interested, you could email me and I'd have a look and make a more specific recommendation.
Okay, so we have one last question by Gabriel. He asks, what was Marshall's major influence, and which authors do you think best represent what Marshall thought today?
Well, I can't think of anyone who has that kind of breadth, of the kind of the mathematical ability, the sheer volume of information that he was aware of, and also being able to innovate in the way that he did. But as I say, I think it sounds counterintuitive, but I think Maynard Keynes is a true student of Marshall. I mean, certainly in the 1920s, that's why I won't. Well, he edited the Cambridge University economics handbooks, and he had a little thing at the beginning, which is basically all about the fact, the same idea, that economics is not a settled body of facts of theory. It is a set of analytical tools which you use to apply to problems. And incidentally, what I didn't say also, that Marshall used to dismiss theoretical development or particular theories as toys. He really thought that very theoretical exposition of problems was something one should avoid. And Pigou as well, who says coming back into phase. But I really couldn't say today who might actually associate themselves with the Marshallian approach.
Well, thank you very much. That was a perfect bridge, because next week we would like to invite you to come to see the Keynes session. So we're moving forward into the 20th century. And thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Kit, for today's engaging lecture. And see you next time.
Thank you very much.